Scorched earth, choking grit, lungs burn. The elder walked at the head of the column, his eyes fixed on the horizon, ignoring the sting of salt and dry wind. Behind him, the caravan moved with the rhythmic, heavy drag of those pushed to their physical limit. They had crossed leagues of barren earth, driven by the memory of a promise. Then, the wind shifted. It carried the scent of damp earth and slow-moving water. The elder stopped. He raised a hand, signaling the line to halt. Ahead, the horizon broke. A ribbon of vibrant, deep green cut through the desolation, marking the convergence of two great rivers. The relief was not a sound, but a collective exhale that rippled back through the group. The elder stepped forward, his boots sinking into the dark, soft soil of the riverbank. He knelt, pressing his palms into the cool, damp ground. The journey had ended. The fertile plains of Shinar lay open before them, a vast expanse waiting to be shaped. He stood slowly, watching as the others moved toward the water, their movements quickening with the sudden, sharp realization that they had finally reached their destination. The elder remained on the riverbank long after the others had dispersed to find water. He walked the perimeter of the flat, open plain, his boots marking a deep path in the silt. This was not merely land, it was a blank slate. He turned in a slow circle, his gaze sweeping from the eastern river to the western tree line. In his mind, the emptiness began to fill. He visualized the placement of massive walls, the orientation of long, wide streets, and the central point where a structure would rise to touch the sky. He paced off the distance between two ancient palms, calculating the space needed for the foundation. The air here was heavy with promise, thick and still. He reached down and scooped a handful of clay, rolling the damp earth between his fingers until it felt firm and pliable. It was perfect. He looked toward the horizon, his jaw set, and his grip on the clay tightened. The responsibility of this new beginning settled on his shoulders, heavier than any pack he had carried on the trek. He knew that what they built here would redefine the earth. He turned back toward the camp, his stride purposeful and steady, his mind already constructing the blueprints of their future. As twilight deepened into true night, the elder walked to the center of the camp. He struck flint against stone, igniting the first torch. One by one, others followed, until a wide circle of firelight pushed back the encroaching shadows of the plain. Hundreds of people gathered, their faces etched with the fatigue of the long journey, yet their eyes fixed intently upon him. The elder raised both hands, his calloused palms open. He spoke, not with abstract promises, but with a clear, resonant call to action. He pointed toward the soft, pliable earth beneath their feet, then traced a line toward the stars. The people leaned in, the murmurs of the day dying out, until the only sound was the crackle of burning resin. He described a tower of brick and bitumen that would stand as a monument to their unity, a beacon that would never be extinguished. He gestured to the vast, empty horizon, painting a picture of a city that would house every family under one roof. The crowd shifted, moving closer, the hesitation of the desert crossing, replaced by a sudden, sharp clarity of purpose. A ripple of agreement moved through the circle. They looked at the elder, then at each other, and the dream took root. The sun broke the horizon, casting a harsh, flat light across the plain. Before the first worker stirred, the elder was already at the edge of the riverbed. He knelt in the silt, the damp ground cooling his knees. He hauled a heavy wooden frame into place, the timber groaning under the strain. He reached into the pit and pulled up a thick, gray mass of clay, slapping it wet and heavy into the mold. He pressed his palms deep into the mud, his fingers kneading the material until it filled every corner of the frame. He smoothed the top with a flat stone, creating a surface as level as the horizon itself. He lifted the wooden frame, leaving behind a perfectly shaped, rectangular block of earth. This was the first unit of their mountain. He stood, wiped the mud from his calloused palms onto his legs, and stepped back to inspect the result. It sat firm, dark, and heavy against the lighter soil. Across the camp, the first fires of the morning began to smoke. Other workers emerged, carrying their own tools, their eyes following the elder's lead. He pointed to the clay pit, then to the foundation line. The work had begun. The silence of the morning broke, replaced by the rhythmic thud of clay hitting wood. By midday, the heat of the sun was matched by the roaring of the kilns. The elder walked between the rows of drying bricks, his fingers tracing the edges of the sun-hardened rectangles. He moved to the center of the construction zone where the massive brick-lined pits had been prepared. He took a torch from a worker and thrust it into the fuel-laden base. Orange flames spiraled upward, licking the sides of the mud-packed walls. The air shimmered, thick with smoke and the scent of baking earth. The elder stepped back, shielding his face from the sudden, blistering intensity. He watched as the heat did its work, drawing the moisture from the bricks, binding the particles into something harder than the river clay from which they were born. He reached into the cooling rack, pulled out a finished brick, and tapped it with a stone. It rang with a sharp, dense sound. He felt the weight of it in his hand, a solid piece of evidence that his vision was becoming permanent. He looked out over the vast expanse of the site, where dozens of fires now burned, each one a small sun feeding the growth of his monument. Every brick was a testament to his direction. The sun hung high, but the elder focused his attention on the dark, bubbling pits at the edge of the construction site. He walked to the brim of the basin, where the earth wept thick, black sludge. He dipped a wooden paddle into the viscous pool, pulling it up to observe the tar as it stretched and clung to the wood. It was stubborn, heavy, and possessed a grip that defied the desert heat. He signaled the carriers, who approached with heavy clay pots. They scooped the bitumen, the dark liquid glopping into their containers with a wet, rhythmic sound. The elder followed them to the rising foundation. He watched as a mason poured the tar between two bricks, pressing them together with such force that the black mortar squeezed out from the seams. He wiped a smudge of the sticky substance between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the incredible tension of the bond. It was an adhesive that would hold the monument together through time itself. He looked at the seam, now sealed and impenetrable. He imagined the tower rising, a monolith of baked earth and black stone, never to be sundered. The workers moved with renewed urgency, their hands stained dark as they locked the foundation into an unbreakable, singular unit. The foundation now spanned the plain, a massive square of baked brick that locked the earth into a singular, immovable footprint. The elder walked the entire perimeter, his pace slow and deliberate. He counted the strides, measuring the sheer breadth of the project. At the southern corner, he stopped. The heavy weight of the bricks had caused a slight dip in the soil, threatening the level of the structure. He signaled the overseers immediately. They arrived with stone levers and extra clay, packing the earth until the base was flush once more. The elder watched the correction, satisfied that even the ground bowed to his design. He moved to the center of the platform and looked toward the horizon. The site was alive with movement. Hundreds of workers moved in rhythmic lines, their confidence growing with every row of bricks laid. They no longer looked at the ground. They looked at the structure. The sheer scale of the square base dwarfed the surrounding tents, signaling a shift from a temporary camp to a permanent monument. He stood at the edge of the platform, the heat radiating from the bricks beneath his feet. The foundation was set. It was a platform for something that would soon dwarf the world itself. He looked at the workers, seeing the pride in their steady hands, knowing the base was ready for the heights to come. The era of the ground was over. The elders signaled the architects, and the first massive beams of timber were hoisted into place. They rose from the brick foundation like fingers reaching for the clouds. Scaffolding began to spiral around the exterior, a complex skeleton of wood and rope that climbed higher with every passing hour. Workers hauled baskets of supplies, their feet finding purchase on the rungs as they ascended into the thinning air. The wood groaned under the pressure, a deep, rhythmic protest of timber against the strain of height. The elder stood on the base, his head tilted back until his neck ached. He watched the structure peel away from the earth, shedding the limitations of the flat plain. It was no longer a building. It was a ladder of ambition. The wind picked up, swirling dust around the higher levels, But the workers did not falter. They hammered, lashed, and climbed, driven by the singular vision of the summit. The elder felt the scale of the tower shifting. It had stopped being a project of mud and stone and had become a challenge to the atmosphere itself. He traced the spiraling path with his eyes, watching as the top tiers vanished into the shimmering heat haze above. The tower was finally leaving the world behind, and he followed it with every breath. The elder stood on the central platform, his eyes scanning the vast site with the precision of an overseer. Below him, the labor force moved in a seamless, tireless rhythm. Chains of men passed baskets of clay and bitumen without a single wasted motion. Each worker acted as a gear in a massive, living machine. He watched the line falter for a heartbeat near the western ramp, a slight delay in the supply chain that threatened the momentum of the entire tier. He raised his hand, a sharp gesture that caught the attention of the foreman. The adjustment was immediate. The flow resumed, tighter and faster than before. The elder felt a surge of cold clarity. He was not merely managing men. He was directing a singular, unified organism. The sound of the site was a constant, low-frequency hum, the collective breath of 1,000 people working toward one goal. He saw the sweat on their brows and the calloused grip of their hands, but he cared only for the output. The tower rose because the people had surrendered their individual will to his design. Every brick laid was a testament to his authority. He felt the weight of the structure beneath him, a physical manifestation of his command, and it felt as natural as the beating of his own heart. He was the architect of their unity, and the results were flawless. From his vantage point, the elder looked past the base of the rising monument toward the sprawling settlement that fed its ambition. It was a grid of perfect order. Thousands of mud brick houses stretched across the plain, arranged in precise, intersecting lines that mirrored the logic of his own mind. He watched the smoke rise from hundreds of cooking fires, each thin column ascending in tandem with the others. There was no chaos here. Every path between the dwellings was a straight line. Every intersection was a calculated node of activity. He saw women tending to grain stores and children moving supplies along the designated thoroughfares, all functioning within the boundaries he had mapped out. The city was a living map of his design, a vast, stable network that supported the vertical climb above. He traced the outer perimeter of the settlement, noting how the residential blocks pressed against the edge of the site, serving as the foundation for the central project. He felt a profound satisfaction in this geometry. The people lived, ate, and slept in patterns he had dictated. Civilization was not a natural occurrence. It was a deliberate structure, and he was its master. He looked down at the grid, then back up at the rising stone, feeling the weight of the city as a solid, obedient base for his ultimate ambition. The sun dipped toward the edge of the world, bleeding crimson across the sky. The elder remained at the summit, his gaze fixed on the horizon as the light failed. As the shadows lengthened, the tower began to change. It ceased to be a collection of bricks and mortar. It became a jagged, obsidian silhouette that pierced the darkening clouds. He watched the shadow of his creation stretch miles across the plain, swallowing the city below and reaching into the distance. It looked like a spear driven into the heart of the earth. The air grew cold, but he did not move. He stood at the highest point, a solitary figure against the fading glare of the sun. The landscape seemed to shrink before him, flattened by the sheer scale of the monument. He felt the vast expanse of the plain bow beneath his shadow. He was no longer just an overseer of men. He was the conqueror of the horizon, the one who had finally turned the unruly earth into a pedestal for his reach. The silence at the summit was absolute. He breathed in the cooling air, his eyes tracking the final sliver of light as it vanishes, leaving the world defined by the sharp, imposing lines of his work. The elder descended from the exposed summit into the quiet containment of the inner chamber. Here, the wind did not penetrate. The only sound was the scrape of a stylus against damp clay. He pushed aside the architectural drafts of the foundation and spread out a fresh, smooth tablet. His hands, stained with the dust of the construction site, moved with clinical precision. He began to map the night sky. He did not care for the mundane logistics of mortar or load-bearing weights anymore. He traced thin, deliberate lines across the clay, connecting points of light that flickered far beyond the reach of his masonry. Each stroke was a calculation of distance, an attempt to bridge the gap between the man-made stone and the celestial fire. He squinted at the tablet, his fingers trembling slightly as he measured the arc of a constellation against the zenith of his tower. He was no longer building a structure. He was building a staircase of logic. He ignored the muffled shouts of the night shift below. His reality had narrowed to the dimensions of the clay and the geometry of the stars. He pressed the stylus deep into the surface, marking the exact coordinate where he intended to meet the unknown. The heavy stone door of the inner chamber groaned as the elder pushed it open. He stepped out onto the high wooden platform, the morning sun cresting the horizon behind him. The light caught the intricate bronze ornaments pinned to his chest and shoulders. They flared with a sharp, blinding intensity, casting jagged reflections against the scaffolding and the faces of the workers far below. He stood at the very edge of the platform, the wood creaking under his weight. He did not look down at the city or the thousands of laborers hauling heavy baskets of mud brick. He tilted his head back, his neck corded with tension, and extended his right arm toward the zenith. His fingers splayed wide as if to grasp the very fabric of the sky. The bronze plates on his wrists caught the light again, pulsing like captured fire. He stood motionless, his back straight, his chin lifted. He remained in that pose for a long minute, a statue of pure ambition suspended above the world. Below, the rhythmic sound of thousands of feet slowed, then stopped. The entire site turned to watch him. He was a beacon of metal and stone, projecting a singular, unyielding will that demanded the heavens acknowledge his reach. The sun hung like a molten weight over the plains, turning the air into a shimmering haze of heat. Workers reached up to swipe salt-crusted sweat from their brows, their skin darkened and cracked by months of exposure. Every breath felt like inhaling dust from the kiln pits. High above, the elder remained motionless, his arms still locked in that upward gesture. He did not lower his hand. Instead, he snapped his fingers, a sharp, metallic sound that cut through the low murmur of the site. He pointed toward the higher tiers, signaling for the next load. The foreman below scrambled, lashing out at the workers to move faster. A man at the base of the scaffolding stumbled, his knees buckling under the weight of a heavy basket of mud bricks. He caught himself against a support beam, his muscles trembling in visible, rhythmic spasms. He did not stop. He heaved the basket onto his shoulder and began the climb. The elder watched, his gaze unblinking, his posture demanding more than the men possessed. The work pace accelerated. Ropes groaned against the friction of the pulleys. Dust clouds billowed as thousands of feet moved in a desperate, synchronized stampede. The tower rose, brick by brick, fueled by the exhaustion of the hundreds who could no longer refuse the command. The final row of bricks locked into place with a dull, heavy thud. The structure had moved beyond the reach of the hot, dry winds of the plain. For the first time in years, the air grew cool and damp, thick with white vapor. The elder climbed the last wooden ladder and stepped onto the summit platform. He moved slowly. The mist swirled around his ankles, clinging to his skin like cool water. He looked outward, but the horizon was gone, replaced by a wall of gray clouds. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the moisture, and he felt a strange, sudden weightlessness in his chest. Below him, the sound of the construction site had been swallowed by the altitude. There was no wind here, no heat, no sound of hammers or shouting men. He walked to the edge of the platform and looked down, but he saw nothing except the churning sea of white. He stood perfectly still, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet as the damp air settled on his face. He felt the boundary between the earth and the void vanish. He had reached the summit, and for a long moment, the world of stone and sweat ceased to exist. He was alone in the quiet, suspended in the space where the earth ended and the sky began. Above the reach of the highest clouds, space opened into a vast, silent expanse. The divine presence looked down, not through eyes, but through a singular, encompassing awareness that spanned the entire horizon. The earth curved away, a tapestry of brown plains and winding river veins. From this distance, the massive tower, built with such desperate labor, appeared as nothing more than a jagged, gray needle piercing the vapor. It was a speck of dust against the immensity of the creation. The divine presence observed the structure, noting the rigid, unnatural lines that cut into the natural flow of the winds. The atmosphere around the summit began to react. Air molecules vibrated, creating a static charge that prickled against the very stone of the tower. A sudden, heavy pressure settled over the upper tiers, an invisible weight that demanded recognition. The silence of the void reached down, pressing against the peak with a force that had no source. The scale of the ambition below stood exposed, a tiny, fragile mark on the surface of the world. The gaze remained fixed, and the air grew thick, holding its breath as the observation turned into a deliberate, singular focus upon the one who stood at the top. The air at the summit ceased to move. It grew dense, turning into a heavy, gelatinous medium that resisted every movement of the elder's limbs. He raised a hand, and the light around his fingers fractured into jagged, translucent shards. A low, rhythmic hum began to vibrate through the soles of his feet, traveling up his legs and settling into his marrow. Then, the atmosphere itself began to ripple. The white mist did not drift. It pulled back, revealing streaks of iridescent color that had no place in the natural sky. The elder blinked, but the shimmer intensified, bending the horizon into impossible curved lines. He took a sharp breath, and the air tasted of ozone and scorched copper. A sudden, cold spike of instinct pierced his chest. He backed away, his heels catching on the rough edge of a brick. He reached out to stabilize himself, but his hand passed through a pocket of distorted light that felt like freezing water. The sky above the tower fractured, and the light bled downward, coating the stone platform in a pulsing, unnatural glow. He pressed his back against the cooling masonry, his pulse visible in the rapid rise and fall of his chest, watching as the world he knew began to dissolve into pure, blinding instability. The sound of 10,000 workers vanished. It did not fade, it was deleted. The elder pushed himself away from the masonry and leaned over the edge of the platform. Below, the sprawling grid of the construction site lay open. Thousands of men stood frozen mid-stride. A worker holding a heavy mallet remained motionless, his arms locked in the air. Another, bent double under a basket of mortar, had stopped dead, his posture unchanging. The elder turned his head, scanning the tiers, but the frantic, rhythmic clatter of construction was gone. Only a hollow, ringing silence remained, vibrating against his eardrums like a physical weight. He reached out, grabbing a wooden support beam, but even the friction of his grip produced no sound. The wind had ceased to whistle through the scaffolding. The distant shouting of the foreman had been snuffed out. He looked down at his own feet, expecting a tremor, but the ground was as still as a tomb. The entire project, a mountain of human effort, had been gripped by a sudden, absolute inertia. The elder stood alone in the center of a world that had forgotten how to move, his eyes tracking the rows of silent, rigid figures below, all locked in a suspended, breathless waiting. A sudden, crushing pressure hammered down upon the elder's shoulders. His knees buckled, snapping against the stone floor, and he gasped as the weight of the air itself increased tenfold. Above the tower, the sky did not simply cloud over, it bruised. A deep, unnatural violet drained the light from the atmosphere, turning the sun into a pale, sickly disk before it vanished entirely. The elder gripped the edge of a clay-fired block, his knuckles turning white under the strain. Every muscle in his frame burned as he fought to remain upright, but the gravity of the summit had shifted. A low, thunderous vibration began to emanate from the center of the dark expanse above, shaking the mortar from the tower's seams. He looked up, his eyes watering, and saw the air itself folding inward. It was not a storm, it was a presence. A vast, absolute authority descended, radiating a cold, static charge that made the hair on his arms stand rigid. The platform groaned under the unseen force, the wood splintering beneath his palms. He could no longer see the city below, only the encroaching dark that pressed against the tower like a physical wall. The elder bowed his head, pinned by a force that dwarfed the height of their construction. The elder exhaled, his chest heaving as he fought the invisible weight pinning him to the platform. He needed to coordinate the laborers, to signal the end of the pause. He looked toward the nearest overseer, a man he had known for decades, and drew a deep breath. His intent was clear, a command to resume the work, to steady the scaffolding, to return to the task. He opened his mouth and pushed the air from his lungs. The sound that escaped was not the familiar cadence of his tongue. It was a sharp, grating rattle, devoid of meaning or melody. He blinked, the vibration of it alien even to his own ears. He tried again, shaping his lips for a common word, but the output was a hollow, rhythmic clicking. The worker nearby turned, his gaze snapping toward the platform. The man's brow furrowed into a deep, sharp crease of confusion. He stared at the elder, his eyes wide, waiting for a familiar instruction that never arrived. The elder reached out, his hand trembling, trying to force his throat to form the correct vowels. The result was only a series of strange, melodic whistles that sounded like wind through a cracked stone. The worker stepped back, his expression shifting from confusion to a dawning, frantic alarm. The elder gripped the wooden railing, his knuckles raw and white. He tried to reclaim his voice, forcing his jaw to lock into the familiar positions of his people, but his tongue felt heavy and detached. He shouted again. A stream of jagged, unfamiliar syllables erupted from his throat, echoing across the open platform like stones hitting a canyon floor. Below, a stonecutter paused, his mallet hovering midair, and shouted back a question. The sound that came from the worker was a rhythmic, guttural hum that bore no relation to the elder's speech. They stared at each other, the distance between them suddenly turning into a vast, unbridgeable chasm. The infection of incomprehension rippled outward. From the base of the tower to the highest scaffolding, the rhythmic chanting of the work crews fractured. A mason dropped his chisel. An overseer barked an order that sounded like the screech of metal on metal. The air filled with a rising tide of clashing, alien dialects. Shouts of frustration collided, overlapping into a singular, discordant roar. Men grabbed their companions, their faces twisting in frantic search for a word they could recognize, finding only silence or strange, melodic gibberish. The unity of the construction site dissolved into a swirling, chaotic sea of noise. The rhythm of the site died. A heavy, woven basket slipped from the grip of a worker on the third tier. It plummeted, striking a support beam with a sharp, splintering crack before spilling its load of baked bricks into the dirt below. No one moved to catch it. No one shouted a warning that could be understood. The laborers stood frozen, their hands still clutching tools that had become useless appendages. A secondary basket, caught on a pulley system, began to tilt. The tension in the rope slackened, then snapped, sending the heavy load crashing into the mud. The elder remained on his platform, his hands pressed against his ears, as if to block out the rising discordance of his people. He looked down at the grid of the city, watching as the organized lines of workers crumpled into panicked, aimless clusters. The tower groaned, the weight of thousands of bricks suddenly unbalanced by the cessation of work. A support beam shifted, groaning under the pressure, and the scaffolding shuddered. He saw the pride of his design transform into a jagged, dark silhouette. The project he had built on the promise of a single, unified voice was coming apart in silence. He watched the final basket tumble, its contents scattering like bone fragments across the base of the foundation. The roar of the site vanished. It did not fade. It was deleted. A profound, crushing stillness settled over the plain, heavy as tectonic rock. The elder stood on his platform, his lungs burning, his throat raw from attempts to speak. He looked up. The sky seemed to press down, a vast, invisible weight centering its focus on the tower. He felt a sudden, sharp pressure behind his eyes, a sensation of being observed by a force that transcended geometry. The divine presence was not a sound, but a command that rewrote the air itself. Every word the elder had ever known turned to ash in his mind. He reached out to a nearby worker, grabbing the man by the shoulder, desperate to reclaim the connection they once shared. The man recoiled, his face a mask of absolute, hollow terror. He spoke, but the sounds were nothing more than a series of discordant clicks and whistles that the elder could not decipher. The barrier was complete. The elder looked down at his own hands, then at the massive, useless bricks beneath his feet. He understood then that the architecture of his ambition had been a direct challenge to a power he could not comprehend. His hubris had created a wall that no tool could break and no language could span. The elder descended the wooden ramp, his feet stumbling on the uneven steps. He pushed into the heart of the main plaza, where the air was thick with sharp, frantic cries. Men and women stood in small, tight circles, their faces twisted with a primal, desperate confusion. He approached a group of masons, his hands held out in a gesture of peace and reason. He spoke, pleading with them to return to their tasks, but his voice was swallowed by the surrounding cacophony. A mason stared at him, eyes wide and darting, then shoved the elder backward. The movement was sudden, violent, and devoid of the respect they had held for him only hours before. The elder fell against a pile of raw clay, the grit scratching his skin. He stood again, frantic to regain control, waving his arms to command their attention. The crowd reacted with a collective recoil. They perceived his frantic movements not as guidance, but as a threat. A woman pointed at him, her voice cracking with a high, unrecognizable pitch that sounded like a warning to those around her. The circle tightened, pushing him toward the edge of the site. He was no longer a leader, but an object of their growing, frantic fear. The finality arrived through the sound of steel striking earth. A mason, unable to articulate his terror, dropped his heavy bronze hammer. It hit the packed dirt with a dull, ringing thud that cut through the chaotic noise. One by one, the others followed. A chisel fell, then a wooden mallet, then a basket of mortar. The metallic clatter rippled outward, a cascading sound of surrender. Each impact signaled the end of the collective endeavor. The elder watched as the tools piled up, abandoned in the dust. The frantic shouting tapered off into a breathless, heavy silence. He remained in the center of the plaza, his arms still raised, his mouth still forming words that had no meaning to anyone but himself. The air grew thin and cold. He looked at the massive, unfinished structure rising above him, now nothing more than a jagged tomb of mud and stone. The workers were no longer looking at him. They were looking past him, at the horizon, their bodies turned away in a synchronized rejection. He stood in the center of the ruin, his own breath loud in his ears. The weight of the silence pressed into his chest, colder than the wind, confirming the absolute truth of his solitude. The dream was not merely paused, it was dead. The unity of the camp dissolved into a frantic geometry of movement. Families drifted together, drawn by the sudden, inexplicable clarity of their own specific, evolving dialects. A mother clutched her children, her voice sharp and rapid, pulling them toward a small cluster of people who shared her rhythm of speech. Nearby, a group of builders gathered their meager belongings, their words flowing in a sequence that sounded alien to the neighbors who had stood beside them for years. The elder stood near the base of the mud brick foundation, watching the migration. He stepped toward a man he had known for decades, his hand outstretched in a silent plea for recognition. The man looked at him, his face a mask of hollow confusion, and turned his back to join a group moving toward the western hills. The elder's hand dropped to his side. The plaza, once teeming with the synchronized energy of thousands, now resembled a fractured mosaic. The groups moved away like water spilling from a broken vessel, each current pulling further from the center. He stood motionless, while the sound of their retreating footsteps crunched against the dry earth. He was the anchor of a ship that had already sailed, left behind on the barren plain as the horizon swallowed the last of his people. The sun dipped below the plain, casting long, bruised shadows across the base of the structure. The elder remained alone, his shadow stretching thin and jagged against the mud brick foundation. He reached out, pressing his palm against the rough, sun-baked surface. It was cool now, indifferent to the heat of his ambition or the sweat that had birthed it. The tower rose behind him, a massive, uneven spine of clay that stopped abruptly, reaching for a heaven it would never touch. He walked the perimeter of the base, his sandals kicking up puffs of dust that settled instantly in the stagnant air. Every brick he touched felt heavy, inert, and entirely human. He stopped, tilting his head back to trace the silhouette of the upper tiers against the darkening sky. The height, once a source of pride, now appeared as a monument to arrogance. The divine presence remained silent, vast, and unreachable. The elder stood amidst the cold, silent mass of his own creation, finally feeling the crushing weight of the gap between stone and spirit. There was no resonance here, no response from the heavens, only the gathering dark and the hollow, absolute stillness of a dream turned to ruin. He stood still, a single, small figure dwarfed by the failure of his own design, waiting for a signal that would never come. The elder turned his back on the monument. The silence of the plains felt heavier than the weight of the stone. He walked toward the edge of the camp where a small, quiet group waited. They were the ones who had found no place in the departing caravans, their faces drawn, their eyes searching his for a sign of what remained. He did not speak. There were no words left that could hold the weight of their loss. He simply raised a hand, pointed toward the rising moon, and began to walk. The group followed, their footsteps rhythmic and soft against the parched earth. They moved slowly, leaving the shadow of the tower behind. Each step pulled them further from the grid of their old lives. The elder kept his gaze forward, watching the horizon swallow the silhouette of the unfinished tiers. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant rain. No one looked back. The collective memory of the tower began to fade with every mile they put between themselves and the ruin. They were no longer builders of a single peak, but travelers on an endless, sprawling map. As the night deepened, the group disappeared into the vast, featureless expanse, becoming small silhouettes against the dark, infinite curve of the world. Years had smoothed the lines of the past into the quiet rhythm of the valley. The elder sat on a flat stone, his back against the trunk of a willow that dipped into a clear, running stream. Before him, the meadow stretched out, vibrant and green, a sharp contrast to the dust of the plain. Children sprinted through the long grass, their laughter sharp and bright. They shouted to one another in a rapid, flowing speech that bore no resemblance to the tongues of the old world. It was a new sound, born of this soil, fluid and alive. He watched a girl chase a boy toward the tree line, her hand outstretched, calling out a command that made the boy skid to a halt and laugh. The elder rested his hands on his knees, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun soak into his skin. He did not reach for the sky today. He did not measure the ground for foundations. He simply watched the fire being prepared, small twigs snapping under the weight of dry branches. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. He took a slow breath, listening to the unfamiliar cadence of the children, and felt the tightness in his chest finally unravel. This was enough. The valley held them, and for the first time, he let the silence of the horizon be. The fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows against the elder's face. He turned his gaze upward, where the stars hung like pinpricks in an endless velvet shroud. The vastness did not feel empty tonight. It felt like a map, carefully drawn. He looked past the edges of his own valley, toward the dark silhouettes of the distant ridges. There, tiny points of orange light flickered in the blackness, the campfires of other tribes, other families, all speaking their own new, unique sounds. The elder traced the line of the horizon, his fingers gripping the rough bark of his staff. He understood now. The tower had been a cage of one language, one ambition, one narrow path. But this scattering was a deliberate unfolding. The divine presence had not destroyed their work out of malice, but to expand the boundaries of the world. Every plume of smoke rising from a distant settlement was a thread in a tapestry far wider than he had ever dared to imagine. He leaned back, letting the cold night air brush against his skin. The silence was no longer a void. but a breath held in anticipation. He watched the stars, seeing them not as distant lights, but as the steady eyes of a grand, unfolding design that reached far beyond the limitations of mortal hands.